The full text of Eileen Zhang's Love in a Fallen City. Chapter O'Neill. Mrs. Bai said, "I'll get up right now. You turn on the light." The lights were lit in the room, and the fourth grandmother helped the old lady sit up and helped her get dressed and get out of bed. Old Mrs. Bai asked, "Mrs. Su has found a suitable person?" Fourth grandma said, "She sounds good, but she is a few years older." Old Mrs. Bai coughed and said, "This child Balu is also 24 this year. It's really a knot in my heart. I worried about her and let people say that she is not my biological child, and I delayed it intentionally. Let's kill her." The fourth grandma helped the old lady to the outer room, and the old lady said, "Take out the new tea leaves from my place and make a bowl for Mrs. Su. What's in the green iron tube is the Longjing tea that my eldest aunt brought last year. The one in the tall jar is Bilwachun. Don't make a mistake." The fourth grandma agreed and shouted at the same time, "Here comes someone." Turn on the light. There was a sound of footsteps, and some children with big hands and feet came to help the old woman carry the old lady downstairs. Liusu sneered and said, "Third brother has thought so thoughtfully for me. It's a pity that it's too late. The marriage has been divorced for 7 or 8 years, according to you. Those legal procedures at the beginning were all nonsense. We can't take it with us. The law is a joke." Third master said, "Don't use the law to bluff people. The law is changed today and will be changed tomorrow. I am a human being and follow the 3 cardinal principles and 5 constant principles, but I can't change it. You were born into his family. Death is the ghost of his family. The tree is thousands of feet tall, and the leaves fall back to their roots." Liusu stood up and said, "Why didn't you say this 7 or 8 years ago?" The third master said, "I'm afraid you are too worried. When we refused to take you in," Liusu said, "Oh, now you are not afraid that I will be too careless? You have used up all my money, so you are not afraid that I will be too careless?" The third master asked directly to her face, "I used your money? How much money did I spend on you? You lived in our house, ate our food, drank our food. In the past, you just paid us back. Adding a person was just a pair of chopsticks. Now you go and ask, what is the price of rice? I won't mention the money. You brought up the money." There was no light in the back room, and all she could see was her mother lying on the big mahogany bed under the tall curtain, slowly waving a white fan. Liusu walked to the bed. Her knees softened, and she knelt down, lying on the edge of the bed, choking and saying, "Mom." Old Mrs. Bai's ears were good, and she heard everything said in the outer room. She coughed, reached out to find a small spit jar on the pillow, spit out a mouthful of sputum, and then said, "Your fourth sister-in-law is such a mouthful. You can't have the same knowledge as her. You know, everyone has their own differences. Difficulty. Your fourth sister-in-law is born to be strong-willed and has always been in charge of the family. She just wants to blame your fourth brother for his dissatisfaction, whoring and gambling, not counting his illness. He should not have misappropriated money from the public account and harmed you. The fourth sister-in-law has no shame, so she has to let your third sister-in-law take charge of the house. I can't swallow this breath in my heart. It's really uncomfortable. Your third sister-in-law is not in good spirits. It's not easy to support this family. You have to be considerate of them in various places." Liusu listened to her mother's words and blindly avoided the important and ignored the easy. She felt so boring that she had no choice but to say nothing. Old Mrs. Bai turned over and fell asleep, and then said, "In the first 2 years, I scraped together here and there and sold the land once, which was enough for 2 years. But it can't be done now. I'm old. I can leave as soon as I say goodbye. I can't care about you anymore. There is no such thing as a feast that lasts forever. If you follow me, it won't be a long-term solution, but it's more serious to go back, live with a child and survive for more than 10 years, and you will eventually make your mark." Liusu dodged quickly, grabbed the fourth master and said, "Fourth brother, look, you should judge." The fourth master said, "Don't be anxious. If you have something to say, we will discuss it in the long term." Third brother, "This is all planned for you." Liusu threw his hand away angrily and went into the back room. The fourth master listened attentively, and sure enough, The third master, the third grandma, and the fourth grandma came all the way upstairs. And he was so anxious that he didn't know what they were saying. In the main room behind the balcony, there were Miss 6, Miss 7, Miss 8, and the children in 3 and 4 bedrooms, who were all a little embarrassed at this time. The fourth master was on the balcony, looking into the light in the dark, and he was very discerning. When the door opened, he saw the third master wearing a sweatshirt and shorts, standing on the threshold with his legs spread, and with his hands behind his back. He slapped his buttocks. Mosquito shouted to the fourth master from a distance, "Guess what, fourth?" The one the sixth sister left said he had pneumonia and died. The fourth master put down his hookah and walked into the room and asked, "Yes, who wrote the letter?" The third master said, "Mrs. Su." After saying that, he turned around and used a fan to chase away the third grandma and said, "Don't follow me to join in the fun. Mrs. Su is still downstairs. She is fat and afraid of climbing stairs. Why don't you go and accompany her?" The third grandma went. The fourth master said thoughtfully, "Isn't the one who died a relative of Mrs. Su?" The third master said, "No. It seems that their family specially asked Mrs. Su to deliver the letter to us, of course, with intention." Fourth master asked, "Could it be that they want sixth sister to go to the funeral?" Just as he was talking, the door curtain moved, and old Mrs. Bai asked, "Who is it?" Grandma No, poked her head in and said, "Mom, Mrs. Su is still downstairs, waiting to tell you about seven sisters' marriage." Liusu was so angry that she was shaking all over. She put the face of a half-embroidered slipper against her chin, and her chin was shaking so much that it seemed like it was about to fall down. The third master said again, "I remember that when you came home crying and clamoring for a divorce, it was only because I was a bloody man. Seeing you beating him like that, I couldn't bear it. So I stood up with a pat on my chest and said, 'Okay, I am Bai Lao, although the three poor are poor. My family can't afford my sister's bowl of food. I just ask you, young couple, who doesn't have a temper, at worst, you can go back to your parents' home to live for 3 to 5 years, and you will change your mind in 2 days. If I knew you seriously, it's a clean break. Will I help you get a divorce?' Breaking up a couple is a matter that only children and grandchildren have to deal with. I, Bai Laozen, have sons, and I still count on them to provide for them in their old age." Liusu was extremely angry, but instead he laughed loudly and said, Okay, it's all my fault. You were poor, and it was me who made you poor. You lost money, and it was me who brought you down. Your son died, and I was the one who harmed you. It hurts the vagina." The fourth grandmother grabbed her son's collar, hit his head against the tassel, and shouted, "You are cursing the child with your words. Just by your words. My son, if you die, I have to find you." The third master scraped his scalp with the handle of a fan and said, "It seems that I should." They both glanced at Miss Sixth at the same time. Bai Liusu was sitting in a corner of the room, embroidering a slipper slowly. Just now, the third and fourth masters spoke, as if there was no room for her to speak. "At this time," she said lightly, "I'm divorced, and I'm going to do it again." The widow made people laugh their teeth out. She continued to make her shoes as if nothing had happened, but cold sweat broke out on her fingers. The needles were astringent, and she could no longer pull them out. Third master said, "Sixth sister, that's not what you said. We all know that he was sorry for you a lot. Now that he is dead, do you still remember it in your heart? The 2 aunts and grandmothers he left behind are naturally you can't keep it. Now you are going back to mourn him in an upright manner. Who dares to laugh at you? Although you have not given birth to a boy or a girl, how many nephews are there? You can choose one and adopt him. Although the furniture is not what's left, his family is a big one. Even if you are assigned to guard the ancestral hall, your mother and son will not starve to death." The fourth grandma stood behind the third master and laughed and said, "As for my own flesh and blood, I shouldn't mention money. When it comes to money, it's a long story. I told our fourth grandma a long time ago. I said, 'Fourth son, go and persuade third master that you cannot use sixth aunt's grandma's money to make gold or stocks. You are not in good luck.' As soon as she married into her husband's family, her husband became a prodigal. Come back to your parents' house. seeing that my family is about to be ruined, a born broom star. The third master said, what the fourth grandma said makes sense. If we had not let her become a shareholder at that time, we would never have suffered a complete defeat. The Hukin was playing and pulling it back and forth in the night with thousands of lights, telling its desolate stories. Even if you don't ask, the story in the Hukin should be played by a glamorous actor. 2 long pieces of red rouge pinched Qiang Yao's nose, and she sang and laughed, with her sleeves covering her mouth. However, here only fourth master Bai sat alone in the dark. On the broken balcony, I played the Hukin. While I was pulling, the doorbell rang downstairs. This is a rare thing in Bai mansion. According to the old rules, I would never go out to visit guests in the evening if a visitor comes in the evening, or a telegram is received in the air, unless it is a major emergency. It is likely that someone has died. In order to save daylight, all the clocks in Shanghai were set forward 1 hour, but Bai Gongwan said, we use old clocks. Their 10 o'clock is other people's 11 o'clock. They sing and sing out of tune, unable to keep up with the Hukin of life. Chapter 2. At this time, the fourth master was hiding there alone playing the Hukin, but it was because he knew that there was no room for him to comment in the family meeting downstairs. After Mrs. Zhu left, everyone in the Bai mansion had to study and analyze her suggestions. Mrs. Zhu planned to act as a matchmaker for Baolua to a man named Fan, who had recently had close contact with Mr. Zhu in mining affairs. Mrs. Zhu had always been familiar with his family background and considered him absolutely reliable. Nafan Liuyuan's father was a famous overseas Chinese with many industries distributed in Ceylon, Malaya and other places. Fan Liuyuan is 33 years old this year, and both his parents are dead. Everyone in the Bai family asked Mrs. Zhu why such a standard husband was still single. Mrs. Zhu told them that when Fan Liuyuan came back from England, countless ladies came to their door with their daughters in a hurry and insisted on give it to him. Engage in intrigues, show off your magical powers, and have a great time. This praise made him bad. From then on, he regarded women as the mud under his feet. Due to the special environment in his childhood, his temper was a little weird. His parents' union was informal. His father once went abroad for an inspection and met an overseas Chinese socialite in London, and the two got married secretly. My wife from my hometown also has some rumors. The second wife never dared to return home because she was afraid of her wife's revenge. Fan Liuyuan grew up in England after his father passed away, although the eldest wife only had 2 daughters. Fan Liuyuan had many difficulties in determining his identity legally. He lived alone in England and suffered some hardships before he obtained the right to inherit. To this day, the Fan family members still hold a hostile attitude toward him, so he always lives in Shanghai and never goes back to his old home in Guangzhou. When he was young, he suffered some stimulation, and gradually he went down the road of dissoluteness, whoring, gambling, eating, and doing everything, but he was not interested in family happiness. Grandma Baisi said, such a person must be deliberately picky. Our 7th sister is a concubine, so we are afraid that others will look down on her. It is a pity to leave such a good relative, said the 3rd master. He himself is also a concubine. The 4th grandma said, but he is so dangerous. How can we expect to be able to catch him with our stupid energy? My older girl is smarter. Don't look at her. People are very careful and know the general situation. The 3rd grandmother said, it seems that the age difference is too big. The 4th grandma said, hey, you don't know, the more that kind of person is, the more he likes the younger ones. If my older one doesn't work, there are 2 others. The 3rd grandma smiled and said, the second one of yours is 20 years younger than the one named Fan. The 4th grandma quietly pulled her and said with a stern face, 3rd sister-in-law, don't be so confused. You are protecting Chi Yatu. Who is she from the Bai family? She is separated by a layer of mother's belly, which is far away. Married in the past, no one could get any benefit from her. I did this for everyone's good. However, Mrs. Bai was only worried that her relatives would talk about her mistreatment of the motherless Miss 7. So she decided to follow the original plan and let Mrs. Zhu choose a day to entertain and introduce Baluo to Fan Liuyuan. It was rare for Liusu to hear these fair words, and regardless of whether she was sincere or fake, she felt warm in her heart, burst into tears, and said, "Who told me to be so stupid? Just for these few dollars, I was hurt. I can't leave even if I want to." Mrs. Su said, "Young people are not afraid of not having a way out." Liusu said, "If there is a way to survive, I would have left long ago. I haven't read a few sentences in the book. I can't carry it on my shoulders or lift it in my hands. What can I do?" Mrs. Su said, "Looking for trouble is all fake. Or looking for trouble. The individual is real." Liusu said, "I'm afraid that won't work. My life will be over long ago." Mrs. Su said, "Only rich people who have no worries about food and clothing are qualified to say this. People without money will never be able to finish it. You can just shave your hair and become a sister-in-law. Even if it's a fate, it's still a fate. We can't live without people." Liusu lowered his head and said nothing. Mrs. Su said, "It would have been better if you had entrusted me with this matter 2 years ago." Liusu smiled slightly and said, "No, I'm already 28. Mrs. Su said, 28 is nothing even if you have such a good talent. I'll keep an eye out for you. I'm going to blame you again. I've been divorced for 7 or 8 years. You should have made up your mind earlier. My idea is to fly away and be less angry." Liusu said, "Auntie, you don't know. How can a family like ours be willing to let us go out to socialize, rely on the family? Not to mention that the soldiers don't agree at all. They just agree. Now, I still have 2 younger sisters who have not left the government, and the girls of the 3rd brother and the 4th brother have gradually grown up. It is too late to help them, so they can still take care of me." Liusu suddenly screamed, covered her eyes, stumbled and climbed upstairs. Climbing upstairs, in her own room, she turned on the light, threw herself on the full-length mirror, and looked at herself. Fortunately, she is not that old yet. Her kind of petite body is the one that doesn't look old at all, always with a slim waist and budding breasts like a child. Her face, which used to be as white as porcelain, has now changed from porcelain to jade, translucent, light green jade. The chin was round at first, but in recent years it has gradually become pointed, making the little face look even cuter. The face is quite narrow, but the eyebrows are very wide, a pair of delicate, watery eyes. On the balcony, 4th master played the hookah again, following the ups and downs of the tune. Liusu couldn't help but tilt his head, wink slightly, and make a gesture. When she performed this in front of the mirror, the hookah did not sound like the hookah, but the shengshao, harp playing the quiet temple dance music. She took a few steps to the left and a few steps to the right. Each step she took seemed to be in time with the beat of lost ancient music. She suddenly smiled, a sinister, malicious smile, and the music stopped abruptly. The hookah outside continued to play, but the hookah was telling some distant stories of loyalty, filial piety, and justice, which had nothing to do with her. The 4th grandma was rummaging through boxes and cabinets in the outer room to look for the old lady's private tea. She suddenly laughed and said, "Hey, 7th sister, you came out of nowhere. You scared me." "What did I say?" "You just disappeared in a blink of an eye." "Yes," Balu whispered. "I'm enjoying the cool air on the balcony." The 4th grandma giggled and said, "I'm so embarrassed." I said, "7th sister, you will have your husband's family tomorrow. You have to be careful about everything and don't make troubles so easily. Isn't divorce an easy thing? If you want a divorce, just divorce. It's so ordinary. It's really that easy. Your 4th brother is not successful. Why don't I get a divorce? I also have an Natal family, and I have nowhere to go, but these days, I have to give them a good deal. I have some sympathy. You have to take care of them. And you can't rely on them to settle them down or make them poor. I still have a third of my integrity." Mrs. Su smiled and said, "When it comes to your sister, I'm still waiting for their reply." Liusu asked, "Is there any hope for the 7th sister's matter?" Mrs. Su said, "That's a bit vague. Just now I deliberately let the ladies discuss it by themselves. I said I would go up and have a look and the 6th miss would come. Now it's time to go down. Can you take me down?" "Okay." Liusu had to help Mrs. Su go downstairs. The stairs were old, Mrs. Su was fat, and they creaked when she walked. In the main room, Liusu was about to turn on the light. Mrs. Su said, "No, you can see, they are in the east wing. Come with me, let's talk and laugh, and the matter will be over. Otherwise, we will have dinner tomorrow." It was inevitable that we would meet each other when we were there, but we were so stiff and panicked. Liusu couldn't hear the word eat, and felt a stabbing pain in her heart. She stiffened her throat and forced a smile. "Thank you, Auntie, but I'm feeling a little uncomfortable right now. I really can't see people. I'm afraid I'll lose my mind. I got into trouble by speaking, but I failed to live up to your love for me." Mrs. Su would definitely refuse when she saw Liusu, so she would just let it go and push the door open herself. They have a lot of youth. Children are born one by one, with new bright eyes, new red mouths, and new wisdom, year after year. The eyes are dulled, the people are dulled, and the next generation is born again. This generation has been absorbed into the glorious background of vermilion and gold. The bits and pieces of light gold are the timid eyes of people in the past. The door was closed, and the hall was dark. Two yellow lights shined through the glass lattice at the top of the door and fell on the blue brick floor. In the haziness, you can see a row of book boxes and red sandalwood boxes piled high and low along the wall in the main room, with green clay inscriptions engraved on them. On the natural table in the middle, there is an enamel self-ringing clock in a glass cover. The mechanism has long been broken and has been stopped for many years. There are vermilion couplets hanging on both sides, and there are golden flowers with the word longevity shining on them. One flower supports a big word dripping with ink. In the dim light, each word seemed to be floating in midair, far away from the paper. Liusu felt that she was just a word on the couplet, fluttering and unrealistic. Bai Gongguan is a bit like a fairy cave. A day has passed here, and 1,000 years have passed in this world. But 1,000 years have passed here, and the same day is almost the same, because every day is the same monotony and boring. Liusu crossed her arms and hugged her own neck. 7 or 8 years passed in the blink of an eye. Are you young? It doesn't matter, you will be old in 2 years. Youth is not rare here. She hugged her mother's legs, shook them vigorously, and cried, "Mom, Mom." It was many years ago, when she was only 10 years old. After watching a play, she and her family dispersed in the pouring rain. She stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at people, and people stared at her, separated by an invisible glass cover through the rain-soaked car window. Countless strangers. Everyone is locked in their own little world, and she can't get in even if she breaks her head. She seemed possessed. Suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. She guessed that it was her mother coming, so she tried her best to compose herself and remain silent. The mother she prayed for and her real mother were two different people. The man walked to the bed and sat down. When he spoke, it was Mrs. Su's voice. Mrs. Su advised, "Miss Sixth, don't be sad. Get up. Get up. It's a hot day." Liusu supported the bed and stood up reluctantly, saying, "Auntie, I can't stay here any longer. I have known for a long time that people dislike me, so I just have to say it clearly. Today, I have spoken with gongs and drums in front of each other, and I have no shame to stay here anymore." Mrs. Su pulled her to sit down on the edge of the bed and said quietly, "You are too honest. Don't blame others for bullying you. Your brothers have spent all your money. They should support you for the rest of your life." While Liusu was kneeling desolately in front of her mother's bed. When she heard these words, she pressed the embroidered shoe upper in her hand tightly to her heart. And when she poked a needle on the shoe, she didn't feel any pain even if she pricked her hand. She whispered, "It's impossible to live in this house. It's impossible to live in." Her voice was gray and light, like intermittent murmurs of dust. She seemed to be in a dream, with dust hanging all over her head and face, and she threw herself forward in a daze. She thought she was pillowing her mother's knees, sobbed and cried, "Mom, Mom, you, old man, make the decision for me." Her mother remained silent with a blank face and a smile on her face. Third chapter. Jinji Jinshin also wanted to inquire about the future development, but the third grandma interrupted the fourth grandma several times, and she lost interest. He just said, "I ate later and came back after eating." Mrs. Su then raised her eyebrows and said that one of ours has a lot of friends in Hong Kong, but it's a pity that distant waters can't save close fires. If Miss Six could go there, she might have a lot of friends. Opportunity. In the past 2 years, it can be said that there are a lot of talents from Shanghaians in Hong Kong. Shanghaians naturally like Shanghaians. So I heard that girls from the same hometown are very popular there. Miss Six went there, but she was still worried don't have the right person. You can really grab a handful and pick them out. Everyone felt that Mrs. Su was really good at speaking. 2 days ago, there was a lot of fuss about matchmaking, but suddenly the smoke and fire disappeared. I couldn't help but pretended to be evasive and made a few sarcastic remarks. Old Mrs. Bai sighed and said, "Going to Hong Kong is easier said than done. Just say unexpectedly." Mrs. Su cut her off quickly and said, "If Miss Six is willing to go, I will invite her. I promise to help her if you are busy. You have to help to the end." Everyone couldn't help but look at each other. Even Liusu was stunned. She estimated that when Mrs. Su volunteered to be her matchmaker, she must have been righteous and sincerely sympathized with her situation. He ran errands to find connections for her and invited the man named Zhang to a banquet. This was a bit of friendship, but it would be expensive to take her to Hong Kong. Why did Mrs. Su spend all this money on her for nothing? Although there are many good people in the world, not many fools are willing to be good people in terms of money. Mrs. Su must have some background. Could it be Fan Liuyuan's trick? Mrs. Su once said that her husband and Fan Liuyuan had close business contacts, and the couple probably supported Fan Liuyuan enthusiastically. It is also possible to sacrifice an irrelevant and lonely relative to curry favor with him. Liusu was thinking wildly here, and old Mrs. Bai said, "That can't be done. I can't let you." Mrs. Su laughed and said, "It doesn't matter. I can still afford this little thing. Besides, I still hope I am asking Miss Six to help me. I am dragging the children with me. My blood pressure is high, and I am exhausted. With her on the road, I have someone to take care of everything. I don't treat her as an outsider, and I will have to worry about her a lot in the future." Mrs. Bai was busy being polite on Liusu's behalf. Mrs. Su turned around and asked straight to the point. "Then, Miss Six, you must come with us. Even if you just go shopping, it's worth it." Liusu lowered his head and said with a smile, "You treat me so well." She did a quick calculation. The matter with the surname Zhang is hopeless. Even if someone makes call for her in the future, they will be on par with Zhang, maybe not as good as him. Liusu's father was a famous gambler who lost all his money gambling and was the first to lead them on the road to ruin. Liusu's hands have never touched dominoes or dice, but she also likes gambling. She decided to bet her future. If she loses, her reputation will be discredited and she will be unqualified to be a stepmother to her 5 children. If she wins the bet, she can get Fan Liuyuan, the object that everyone is coveting, and relieve the bad breath in her chest. Jinzi Jinshan was confused by her scolding. The third mistress did her best to stabilize their mother and told them, "We are going to watch a movie first." Jinzi asked in surprise, "Watching a movie?" The third grandma said, "It's not weird. I went there just to watch people. I sat in the dark shadow and couldn't see anything." Later, Mrs. Su told me that they were all like that. Mr. Zhu's suggestion is that he is spoiling it there. He wants to leave it there for 2 or 3 hours. His face will become oily and the rouge pollen will fade, so he can look more kindly. That is Mrs. Zhu's guess. According to my opinion, the man surnamed Fan has never been sincere. He wants to watch a movie just because he is too lazy to socialize with us. After watching the play, doesn't he just want to run away? The fourth grandmother couldn't help but interjected, "Where?" In other words, what happened today was pretty good at first. If it weren't for the people in our own nest causing trouble, there would have been a 70% to 80% failure. The golden branches and golden cicadas said in unison. Third mom, "What happened next? What happened next?" Jin Chen asked. "Then what kind of person is Fan Liuyuan?" Third mistress said. "How do I know? I haven't heard him say even 3 words." After thinking for a while, he said, "You're a pretty good dancer." Jinzi exclaimed, "Who is he dancing with?" The fourth grandma answered first. "Who else is it?" but it's not your sixth aunt. In our Shilly family, no one is allowed to learn to dance. She was the only one who learned this skill from her talented uncle after she got married. How embarrassing. When people ask you, why don't you get married if you say you can't dance? It's not a shame if you can't. Things like your third mother, like me. We are both young ladies from a wealthy family. We have lived half of our lives. What kind of things have we not seen in the world? We don't know how to dance. The third grandmother sighed and said, I jumped once and said, you're trying to show off someone's face. And you danced a second time, a third time. Jinzi Jinshin couldn't help but be speechless after hearing this. The fourth grandma murmured to the other side again, Lord has deceived your heart. If you think that you have ruined your sister's affairs, you have hope. I tell you to give up this idea early. There are many young ladies who have he doesn't like you. Why would he want you? A loser. They set out at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and did not return home until 11 o'clock in the evening. Where can I rest assured and sleep well with golden branches and golden cicadas? Looking forward to it, they came back, but everyone was speechless again. Balu walked to the old lady's room with a sullen face. A gust of wind peeled off all the condoms, returned them to the old lady, and went back to the room without saying a word. Jinzi Jinchen dragged the fourth grandma to the balcony and kept asking what was wrong. The fourth grandma said angrily, I have never seen a girl like yours, and you are not on a blind date. I want you to be so hot. The third grandma followed and said softly and slowly, don't let others know what you are saying. Don't worry about it. The fourth grandma simply shouted towards Liusu's room. I just pointed out Sang and scolded Huai. So what if I scolded her? It's not like I haven't seen a man in thousands of years. So why does he get phlegm all over his body when he smells anger? Have you gone crazy? The third grandma said. Later, Mrs. Zhu grabbed him and asked everyone to go to dinner together. He said he was going to treat us with soldiers. The fourth grandma clapped her hands and said, eat. Just eat. What does it mean to go to the dance hall and sit down even though we, Miss Seven, know that we can't dance? I didn't say it, but it's the third brother's fault. He's also a runner outside. Hearing the man surnamed Fan telling the driver to go to the dance floor, he didn't even stop him. The third grandma said hurriedly, there are so many restaurants in Shanghai. How does he know which ones have dancing and which ones don't? He is no better than fourth master, idle man. He doesn't have that much time to investigate this. Liusu and Baolu lived in the same room. Baolu had already gone to bed. Liusu squatted on the ground and touched the black dots of mosquito incense. The words on the balcony could be heard clearly, but this time she was very calm and polished. The match, watching it burn away, the small red pennant swaying in its own wind moved to her finger. She blew it out with a pop, leaving only a piece of red. The small flagpole and the flagpole are also withered, and a gray and curled ghost shadow hangs down. She dropped the burnt match in the cigarette tray. She didn't mean what happened today, but anyway, she gave them a little color to see. Do they think her life is over? Morning. She smiled. Balu must also be scolding her in his heart, and the scolding was even worse than the fourth grandmother's words. But she knew that although Baal Woan hated her, he also looked at her with admiration and respect. A woman, no matter how good she is, cannot win the love of the opposite sex, nor the respect of the same sex. Women are just so mean. A few days later, Mrs. Zhu came to Bai Mansion again. The fourth grandma had already prophesied. Our sixth aunt's grandma is making such nonsense, and seeing that the seventh girl's matter is blown away, how can Mrs. Zhu not be annoyed? Mrs. Zhu blamed the sixth aunt's grandma, and is she still willing to introduce someone for her? This is called stealing. The chicken does not cost the rice. As expected, Mrs. Zhu was no longer as angry as before. Yuan Do Chuangshan first explained why she hadn't come to the door in the past 2 days. The master of the family has something important to go to Hong Kong to contact. If everything goes well, he plans to rent a house in Hong Kong and live there for a year and a half. So she has been busy packing her luggage these 2 days and preparing to accompany him. As for the Balu incident, Fan was no longer in Shanghai, so we had to put it aside for the time being. Tassel's possible partner was Zhang. Mrs. Zhu found out after asking about it. It turned out that he had someone outside, still a little troublesome. According to Mrs. Su, this kind of person is not very reliable, so forget it. After hearing this, the third grandma and the fourth grandma winked at each other, curled their lips and smiled. Needless to say, pearl earrings, emerald bracelets, and emerald rings, Baloo must be dressed up in all kinds of flowers. On that day, the old lady, the third master, the third grandma, the fourth master, and the fourth grandma will naturally go. Baloo heard about fourth grandma's conspiracy over and over again, and was really annoyed with her. He refused to appear at the same time as fourth grandma's two daughters, and was too embarrassed to say that he didn't want them. So he tried his best to drag Liusu along. There were 7 people sitting in a dark car, and it was impossible to squeeze in any more. So the fourth grandmother's daughter, Jinzi Jinshan, was eliminated. Mrs. Su took a two-pronged approach, and at the same time she found a man named Zhang for Liusu, who worked in the customs. After his wife died, he left 5 children behind and was eager to renew his relationship. Mrs. Su suggested finishing Baloo's work first, and then helping Liusu get married, because Fan Liuyuan was going to Singapore soon. In the Bai mansion, Liusu's remarriage was simply treated as a joke, just to send her out. They had no choice but to ignore it and let Mrs. Su make trouble for the sake of Baluo. He was so busy that everyone was on their backs. They are the same to daughters. On the one hand, they are in full swing, and on the other hand, they are deserted. In comparison, it is really embarrassing. Old Mrs. Bai plundered all the gold beads from the whole family, and put all the gold beads that could be placed on Baolu. When the girl in the third room celebrated her birthday, the old lady forced the third grandmother to take out a piece of silk clothing given by her godmother and make a cheongsam for Baluo. The old lady's personal savings over the years were mostly made of leather goods, and she couldn't wear leather in the summer, so she had to pawn off a large mink coat and use the money to change a few pieces of jewelry into fashionable styles. Does Fan Liuan really like her? That's not necessarily the case. She didn't believe a word of what he said to her. She could see that he was used to lying to women. She couldn't help it. She was helpless. She only has herself. The moon-white organza cheongsam she took off hung on the bed frame. She leaned over and sat on the ground, hugged the knees of her robe, and rested her face on them solemnly. The green smoke from the mosquito-repellent incense floated up in puffs and puffs until it reached her brain. Tears glistened in her eyes. Chapter for Liusu was dancing when Fan Liuan suddenly appeared and took her from another man's hand. In the Liusu red light, she couldn't see his dark face clearly, and she only felt that he was unusually silent. Liusu smiled and said, "Why don't you speak?" Liuan smiled and said, "I have said everything that can be said in front of others." Liusu smiled and said, "You are so sneaky. What are you saying behind someone's back?" Liuyuan said, "Some silly words not only have to be said behind someone's back, but also behind one's back. It's embarrassing to let oneself hear it. For example, I love you and I will love you forever." Liusu turned away and spat softly. "What nonsense." Liuan said, "It's my fault for not speaking, and it's my fault for talking." Liusu smiled and said, "Let me ask you, why don't you want me to go to the dance hall?" Liuyuan said, "General men like to teach good women to be bad, and they also like to reform bad women and make them good women. I am not like that, looking for something to do. I think it's better for a good woman to be more honest." Liusu glanced at him and said, "Do you think you are different from others? I think you are just as selfish." Liusu was tired of running for his life, so he stopped looking at Yan. Mr. Zhu, Mrs. Zhu, and her children came by car to pick her up on the ship. They took the first-class cabin of a Dutch ship. The boat was small and bumpy. As soon as Mr. Zhu and Mrs. Zhu got on the boat, they both fell asleep and vomited non-stop. The son next to them was crying and the daughter was crying. Liusu actually served them for a few days. Finally, the boat docked, and she had the chance to go to the deck and look at the sea view. It was a hot afternoon, and the most eye-catching sight was the giant billboards lined up on the pier. Red, orange, and pink, reflected in the green seawater, one by one, with irritating and offensive signs. The pigments are flying up and down, fighting extremely lively under the water. Liusu thought that even if she fell down in this exaggerated city, it would be more painful than elsewhere. She couldn't help but feel anxious. Suddenly she felt someone running over and hugging her leg, almost pushing her. He fell down and was shocked. When he saw that it was Mrs. Zhu's child, he quickly calmed down and went over to help Mrs. Zhu take care of everything. Unexpectedly, the dozen or so pieces of luggage and the two children refused to be grouped together in a pile. In the blink of an eye, once the luggage was collected, another child was missing. She agreed to Mrs. Zhu. Mrs. Zhu will leave in a week. Liusu was busy packing her luggage. Although the house had nothing to grow and nothing to organize, it was still a mess for a few days. I sold a few odds and ends and made a few sets of clothes. Mrs. Zhu even found time in her busy schedule to serve as a consultant for her. Mrs. Zhu's efforts to win over Liusu were noticed by the people in the Bai mansion, and they gradually developed a new interest in Liusu. In addition to doubting her, he also had some scruples. He whispered and talked about her behind his back, but he didn't scold her in front of her face. Occasionally, he would call her sixth sister, sixth aunt, sixth mess. If she really marries a rich man in Hong Kong and returns home in glory, everyone must leave room for them to meet each other so as not to offend her. The music happened to stop. Liuyuan helped her back to her seat and smiled at everyone. Miss Bai has a headache. I'll send her back first. Liusu didn't notice what he was doing and couldn't think of how to deal with it, and she didn't want to offend him. Because the friendship wasn't deep enough to quarrel, so she had to let him put on her coat and apologize to everyone. We walked out together. He knocked on the door of No. 131. Mrs. Zhu opened the door and let them in and said, "Let's have tea with us. We have a sitting room." Then he rang the bell and called some guests for refreshments. Mr. Zhu walked out of the bedroom and said, "I called Liusu. He wanted to pick up the wind and invite us all to the Hong Kong hotel. That's today." Then he said to Liuan, "Including you." Mrs. Zhu said, "You are really interested. You have been fainting on the boat for several days. Why don't you take a break as soon as possible? Forget it tonight." Liuan smiled and said, "The Hong Kong hotel is the most traditional dance venue I have ever seen. The architecture, lighting, decoration, and band are all in the old British style. Things that were fashionable 40 or 50 years ago are not exciting enough now. There is really nothing to see, except for those weird-looking servants who are very popular. The sky looks like northerners wearing leggings," Liusu said. "Why?" Liuyuan said, "Chinese sentiment." Mr. Zhu said with a smile, "Since I'm here, I have to go and see it. I feel sorry for you to do it. Just be a guest." Liuyuan laughed and said, "I can't say for sure. Don't wait for me." When Liusu saw that he didn't look like he was going, Mr. Zhu was not a frequent dancer. It was rare for him to be so happy. He seemed to be serious about introducing friends to her, but she became confused. However, that night, the people who greeted them in the Hong Kong hotel were all couples of old ladies and gentlemen, and the few single men were all young people in their 20s. We got ashore and hailed cars to the Repulse Bay Hotel. The car drove out of the busy city and walked over mountains and ridges for a long time. Along the way, we saw only lowest cliffs and red clay cliffs. The gaps in the cliffs exposed dense green trees and exposed the blue-green sea. As we approached Repulse Bay, we saw the same cliffs and jungles, but it gradually became brighter. Many people who came back from traveling in the mountains passed by their cars. Car after car was filled with flowers, and scattered laughter was blown away by the wind. Liuyuan smiled and said, "How to be selfish?" Liusu thought to himself, "Your highest ideal is a pure and provocative woman. Being pure and pure is for others." When we arrived in front of the hotel, we couldn't see where the hotel was. They got out of the car and walked up the extremely wide stone steps to a high platform with scattered flowers and trees. They saw two yellow houses higher up. Mr. Zhu had already reserved a room, and the servants led them along the gravel path, into the dim dining room, through the dim hallway, and up to the second floor. Turning a corner, there is a door leading to a small balcony. with a wisteria flower stand erected and half of it basking in the setting sun. There were 2 people standing and talking on the balcony. They saw a woman with her back to them. She had long black hair hanging down to her ankles. She had a red gold twist bracelet on her ankle. She was barefoot and couldn't look carefully underneath. Wearing slippers, a piece of Indian-style pink-pleated narrow leg pants is slightly exposed. A man who was blocked by the woman shouted, "Hey, Mrs. Su." Then he came over, greeted Mr. Zhu and Mrs. Su, and nodded to Liusu with a smile. When Liusu saw that it was Fan Liuyuan, even though he had expected this move, his heart still beat violently. The woman on the balcony disappeared in a flash. Yanagi Yuan accompanied them upstairs. Along the way, everyone seemed to be meeting old friends in a foreign land, constantly expressing surprise and happiness. Although Fan Liuan could not be called a handsome man and was careless, he still had a kind of wind spirit in him. Mr. Zhu and his wife directed the servants to move their luggage. Liuan and Liusu walked in front. Liusu asked with a smile, "Mr. Fan, you didn't go to Singapore?" Liuan replied softly, "I'm waiting for you here." Liusu didn't expect him to be so straightforward, so she didn't want to go into details. She was afraid that it was not Mrs. Su who invited her to Hong Kong, but him who invited her to Hong Kong. However, she couldn't get off the stage, so she just thought he was joking and smiled at him. Liusu was shocked again and asked, "You live next door?" Liuyuan had already opened the door for her and said, "My room is a mess. No one can be seen." Liuyuan asked and found out that her room was number 130. Then he stopped and said, "We're here." Pu took the key and opened the door. As soon as Liusu entered the door, he couldn't help but walk straight to the window. The whole room was like a dark yellow picture frame, framed by a large painting in the window. The thick, glittering sea waves splashed directly onto the curtains, dyeing the edges of the curtains blue. Liuyuan said to Pu, "Put the box in front of the cupboard." Liusu was shocked when she heard his voice right under her ears. When she turned around, she saw that Pu had gone out, but the door was not closed tightly. Liuyuan leaned against the window and stretched out a hand to support the window pane, blocking her sight, and just looking at her and smiling. Liusu lowered his head. Liuyuan smiled and said, "You know, your specialty is bowing your head." Liusu raised his head and smiled. "What? I don't understand." Liuyuan said, "Some people are good at talking, some are good at laughing, and some are good at housekeeping. You are good at bowing your head." Liusu said, "I don't know anything. I am a useless person." Liuyuan smiled and said, "Useless women are the most powerful women." Liusu smiled and walked away. "I won't tell you anymore. Just go next door and have a look." Liuyuan said, "Next door? My room or Mrs. Su's room? Tease, for yourself. If I were a completely good woman, you wouldn't even notice me." She tilted her head towards him and smiled. "You want me to be a good woman in front of others, and a bad woman in front of you?" Yanagi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "I don't understand." Liusu further explained, "You want me to be bad to others, but only good to you." Liuyuan laughed and said, "Why is it reversed again? It's confusing people even more." He pondered for a while and said, "What you said is wrong." Liusu smiled and said, "Oh, you understand." Liuyuan said, "Whether you are good or bad, I don't want you to change. It's rare to meet a real Chinese woman like you." Liusu sighed slightly and said, "I'm just an outdated person." Yanagihara said, "Real Chinese women are the most beautiful in the world and will never go out of style." Liusu smiled and said, "A new school person like you." Liuyuan said, "When you say new school, you probably mean the foreign school. I really can't be considered a real Chinese. It was only in recent years that I gradually became Chinese. But you know, Sinicized foreigners are more stubborn than any old scholar." Liusu smiled and said, "You are also stubborn, and so am I. As you said, Hong Kong Hotel is the most stubborn place to dance." They laughed at the same time. Chapter 5. Liusu is willing to give it a try. To a certain extent, she's willing to do anything. She turned her face towards him and whispered, "I understand, I understand." She comforted him, but she couldn't help but think of her own face in the moonlight. the delicate outline, eyebrows and eyes, so beautiful that it was unreasonable and vague. She slowly lowered her head. Yanagihara giggled. He changed his tone and said with a smile, "Yes, don't forget, your specialty is bowing your head. But some people say that only teenage girls are suitable for bowing their heads. People who are suitable for bowing their heads often fall into trouble as soon as they come." He likes to lower his head. If he has lowered his head for many years, his neck may become wrinkled. Liusu's face changed, and he couldn't help raising his hand to touch her neck. Liuyuan smiled and said, "Don't worry, you will never have it. Go back to the room later. When no one is round, you can unbutton the sleeves and see clearly." Liusu didn't answer, turned around and left. Liuyuan chased after him and said with a smile, "I'll tell you why you can keep your beauty. Sahaisini said last time, she didn't dare to get married because Indian women stay at home and sit all day long when they are free. I just got fat," I said. "What about Chinese women? They don't even want to get fat just by sitting, because getting fat requires at least a little energy. Being lazy also has its benefits." Liuyuan said, "I told you just now, you are a true Chinese. So naturally you will follow her. Its so-called Shanghaians are a little different." Liusu asked, "Is it red?" Liuyuan said, "Red?" In the dark night, she couldn't see the red color, but she knew intuitively that it couldn't be redder, so red that it couldn't be controlled. The fluffy little flowers were nestled on the towering trees, and the wall chestnuts were peeling off and burning all the way through, turning the purple blue sky red. She raised her face and looked up. Liuyuan said, "Cantonese people call it shadow tree. Look at the leaves. The leaves are like ferns, and when a gust of wind passes by, the slender black silhouettes are trembling in scattered places. In my ears, I hear a string of small notes in a trance, like the jingle of an iron horse in front of the eaves." They got in the car, and Liuyuan said again, "Don't look at her airs." She was showing off outside, saying she was Krishna. The biological daughter of Prince Kalampa died because the princess fell out of favor. So he was exiled and has been wandering without being able to return to his country. In fact, it is true that he cannot return to his country, but no one can confirm the rest. Liusu asked, "Has she been to Shanghai?" Liuyuan said, "She is also very famous in Shanghai. Later she followed an Englishman to Hong Kong. Did you see the old man behind her? He is the one who supports her now." Liusu smiled and said, "That's what you men are like. Why don't you flatter her in person, but say behind her back that she is not worth a penny? As a poor old daughter like me, who has a lower status than her, I don't know how you treat others." "You're talking about me." Liuyuan laughed and said, "Who dares to say your two names together in one breath?" Liusu curled her lips and said, "Maybe it's because her name is too long and she can't finish it in one breath." Liuyuan said, "Don't worry. I will treat you as the person you are. That's right." Liusu pretended to be reassured, leaned against the car window, and whispered, "Really?" His words didn't seem to be sarcastic to her, because she gradually realized that when they were alone together, he is polite and looks like a gentleman. I don't know why he is so steady behind his back, but he likes to be arrogant in public. She couldn't figure out for a moment whether it was his weird temper or if he had another effect. Liusu said angrily, "You admit that you love to pretend, but don't involve me. When did you catch me lying?" Liuyuan sneered and said, "Yes, you are a very innocent person." Liusu said, "Come on, stop coaxing me." Liuyuan was quiet for a while and sighed. Liusu asked, "What's not satisfying to you?" Liuyuan said, "There are many books." Liusu sighed, "If you are a free and easygoing person, you still want to complain about your fate, like me. You should hang yourself a long time ago." Liuyuan said, "I know you are unhappy. You must have seen enough of the bad things and bad people around us. However, if this is the first time you see them, you must be even more uncomfortable. That's it. When I came back to China, I was already 24. I had many dreams about my hometown. You can imagine how disappointed I was. I couldn't bear this blow and couldn't help but slide down. If you knew me in the past, Maybe you would forgive me now. Liusu tried to imagine that it was the first time she saw her fourth sister-in-law. She suddenly shouted, "It's still as good as the first time I saw it, but it's worse and dirtier. It's the person outside you. The thing outside you. If you grew up hanging around there, how would you be able to tell which part is which? Is it them? And which part is you?" Liuyuan was silent, and after a while he said, "Maybe you are right. Maybe these words of mine are nothing more than an excuse to fool yourself." He suddenly laughed and said, "Actually, I don't need any excuses. I love to play, I have this money and this time, so why should I find other reasons?" He thought for a while, became irritable again, and asked, she said, "I don't understand myself either, but I want you to understand me. I want you to understand me." As he said this, he was already desperate in his heart, but he still said stubbornly and pleadingly, saying, "I want you to understand me." Liusu first noticed the man's jet black hair, which was braided into two strands and tied high on his head. The Indian woman, although she was dressed in Western style this time, still had a strong Oriental flavor. Under the black gauze cloak, she wore a golden fishtail tight-fitting gown that covered her hands and exposed only her shiny nails. The neckline was dug into a very narrow V shape and opened straight to her waist. It was the latest style in Paris. With this name is called one line of sky. Her complexion was yellow and oily, like a golden Guanyin bodhisattva, but there was a demon hiding in her big, shadowy eyes. A classically straight nose, just a pointed end to thin. Sahishini smiled and said, "She doesn't look like a Shanghai's." Yanagihara smiled and said, "Where do you look like?" Sahishini put an index finger on her cheek, thought for a moment, raised the tips of her 10 fingers, as if she wanted to describe it but couldn't, and shrugged and smiled. He smiled and walked inside. Liuyuan supported Liusu and continued to walk out. Although Liusu didn't understand much English, he understood the difference between appearance and color, so he smiled and said, "I am originally a country boy." When they arrived at Repulse Bay, he helped her out of the car and pointed to the lush jungle beside the driveway. "Look at that tree. It's a specialty of the South. The British call it wild sparkle." I met a group of Western gentlemen head-on, surrounded by a woman like stars holding the moon. Liuyuan said, "Let's go over there for a walk." Liusu remained silent. When he left, she followed slowly. It was still early anyway, and there were many people walking on the road. It didn't matter. A short distance from the Repulse Bay Hotel, there is a bridge flying across the sky. On the other side of the bridge is a mountain, and on this side of the bridge is a wall made of gray bricks, blocking the mountain on this side. Liuyuan leaned against the wall, and Tassel also leaned against the wall. At first glance, the wall was extremely high, and the edge could not be seen. The walls were cold and rough, a dead color. Her face, supported on the wall, changed in contrast. Red lips, watery eyes, a face with blood, flesh and thoughts. Yanagi-Yuan looked at her and said, "This wall, for some reason, reminds me of words like the end of the world. One day, our civilization was completely destroyed. Everything was finished, burned, exploded, collapsed. Maybe there is still this wall left. Liusu, if we had met under this wall at that time. Liusu, maybe you would be a little sincere to me, and maybe I would be a little sincere to you." The thick pink lips seemed swollen. Liuyuan stood still and bowed slightly to her. Liusu was looking at her there, and she was looking at Liusu proudly. Those arrogant eyes seemed to be looking at people from a distance, thousands of miles away. Liuyuan then introduced, "This is Miss Bai. This is Princess Sahishini." Liusu felt awe in his eyes. Sahishini stretched out her hands, touched Tassel's hand with her fingertips, and asked Liuyuan, "Is this Miss Bai also from Shanghai?" Liuyuan nodded.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.